In recent years, companies started including CSR or corporate social responsibility in their strategies and operations. And the term has evolved more recently into ESG or environmental, social, and governance. This week I have a guest. My guest is Suzanne Smith. Suzanne Smith is a friend. She's also the founder and CEO of Social Impact Architects and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at Arlington. We will discuss how CSR and ESG are related to trust, obviously, whether there are trends in them. How do you know if a company deploys them for the right reasons or just to show? And we'll provide some advice for companies considering deploying CSR or ESG. We'll also talk about different generations and how they care about CSR and ESG. Get ready for some intense conversation right after this. Welcome to The Trust Show. I'm Yoram Solomon, your host, the author of the Book of Trust and facilitator of the Trust Habits Workshop. My mission is simple. I want to help you form habits that build your trustworthiness, because the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you? And we are back with our guest this time, Suzanne Smith. Suzanne Smith and I became friends in a political event where we were on opposite sides of the political issue, but it doesn't matter because Suzanne, as you will see, is very smart, very dedicated, and very focused on a topic. Suzanne, as I mentioned, is the founder and CEO of Social Impact Architects. She's also an adjunct professor at UT Arlington. She used to be an adjunct professor at SMU with me, although we never met there, even though I think I spoke in one of your classes. So first of all, Suzanne, welcome to The Trust Show.
Thank you. Well, it's really one of my favorite podcasts, so I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, you are the only listener, actually. Every time I check, no, you're not. Suzanne, what class do you teach at UT Arlington?
Well, I just want to go back to your introduction where I think in this time, it's so important that we talk about, you and I could be on separate sides of an issue at once, but then be together on another issue. I mean, and that's part of political dialogue. So I really appreciate you being the kind of person that would invite someone like me on your podcast and have kind of dueling views on certain things. You know, that's where we get to greater solutions, is when different people from different vantage points kind of come together.
What do you mean invite someone like you? I always invite only smart people.
Well, you know, part of it is, you know, inviting people with different views. And seeing how that can elevate your view. So speaking of which, so yes, I have taught at a number of different universities, Duke, Pepperdine, UNT, University of Texas at Arlington, and SMU. Currently, I'm on a little bit of a sabbatical with SMU, but I'm teaching at UT Arlington currently a class called Social Entrepreneurship. I've also taught corporate social responsibility, nonprofit management, so a number of different things. And it's really one of my favorite ways to stay young is teach the next generation and learn from them. I learn just as much from them as I know you do from people who I'm teaching.
Yes. So, you know, it took a while for me to land on this topic that's called trust and focus on it. What made you focus on that topic, on specifically on the CSR and on ESG? What made you focus on that?
You know, it's a really great question. And so I follow the discipline of something called social entrepreneurship. And so social entrepreneurship came into existence about 30 years ago by the founding father of social entrepreneurship, Greg Dees, who I studied under at Duke. And essentially, this idea of social entrepreneurship came from our very origin story in the United States. When we first got founded, there were only two different legal designations or organizations that were trying to create, interests. So you had business, who had a market based, and you had government, who was trying to help move the country forward. So what happened is there was this missing middle, and I call that both business and government were started by the founding fathers. Nonprofits were started by what I call the founding mothers. So people like Clara Barton with the American Red Cross. And so what they did, and of course across the country as the country expanded, is create all of these really great nonprofits that are part of the fabric of our civil society. So that includes the churches, that includes the schools, that includes the hospitals. And those things got started. And then eventually they took on the designation of the nonprofit status. So we ended up having these three entities that were trying to create good in the world. So businesses were creating goods and services, government was trying to think through where our future was within the country, and then nonprofits were doing social good. So, what really happened is you saw in the last 30 years a meeting in the middle. So, instead of each group having their swim lane, they started to come together and meet in the middle and say, what could we be doing better? So, nonprofits can be more entrepreneurial and use business methods to actually move their mission forward. So, the best examples of that would be Salvation Army with their thrift shops, Girl Scout cookies, the YMCA with their gyms. And then you had corporations who all of a sudden said, you know what, we actually need to be thinking about this too. And we'll talk more about where that came from. But to me, it's just almost like peanut butter and jelly. Like they just go together. And I want to live to see where we don't bifurcate this as much, but we talk about how can business be not only about products and services, but also be a force for good. Same way I want to talk about nonprofits saying, yes, they're a force for good, but they also need to operate like a business. And then, of course, I'd love government to be more innovative. And I know you share that view.
Yes, yeah. Actually, one of my guests on this show was supposed to be the head of innovation in the IRS, and then the IRS reorged, and she's no longer there, and so that kind of killed the whole idea. Let me ask you this: we talk about CSR, we talk about ESG. What's the difference between them? Has there been a transition between them?
So, if you think about it, we had the three separate swim lanes back in the 60s. And so, what really happened is you saw more and more pushing from both consumers as well as the government to say to corporations, it's not enough to make money. We also have to make sure you're a good corporate citizen. So, I always use the example with my students of like Aaron Brockovich and the movie. So we don't want businesses in general to also be making money, but at the same time creating externalities that are hurting society. So polluting our rivers and oceans, putting things in landfills that could potentially leach into the soil. We want to make sure they're treating people properly, so not using child labor. So you and I will remember when Kathy Lee got in trouble with her, clothing line at Kmart. And so what happened is in the 60s, we saw kind of like it's a little bit like a shift in our perspective where we basically said, yes, we want you to make money. And it's really important. And again, every business has a market orientation. You've got to make money in order to survive. But we also want to make sure at a baseline, you're not harming people or harming the environment in order to do that. And so in the 60s, we really saw an evolution. So Peter Drucker was the first to say that we had social responsibility not only as an individual, but also as a corporation. Then you saw, Freeman actually evolve Friedman's view and say, actually, part of the role of a corporation is to think about their stakeholder model. You also had government coming in and saying, we've got the Civil Rights Act, we have a number of different things you need to follow, ADA, et cetera. So putting those requirements on corporations to do those things. And so now you really see in the 80s and the 90s, corporations actually recognizing consumers wanted it too. That consumers were making choices between two different goods and saying, I'm going to go with a corporation, whether I work there or buy there, that actually is a better corporation. And so that has evolved quite significantly. And so that's part of where this comes from is we're in this really interesting kind of messy middle where we're trying to figure out how does this work within corporations? How do we have that duality of you need to make money, but you also need to make sure that you have social impact at the same time. And so there is a real interesting time. It's kind of, I call it the Wild West, because we're still trying to figure out how those two can coexist in corporations and small businesses.
So, but we used to call it corporate social responsibility, CSG, and
Mm-hmm.
we kind of moved to treat this more as ESG. So why do you think that is?
It's interesting. People ask me that question all the time and they get lost in the acronyms and the alphabet soup of this all. The best answer I can give you is that each group, so it could be corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship, conscious capitalism, ESG, is like a brand name, just like there are brand names for cars. You can choose the car you want to drive. Do you want to drive a Honda? Do you want to drive a Cadillac? Do you want to drive BMW? They're all the same. They're all going to get you to your
No, they're
destination.
not. BMW is not the same as anything else, and neither
Well,
is
they're
Jeep.
all the same in its goal. The goal is to get you to your destination. Each one has different features and different things that they emphasize. And so, you'll hear people say one is better than the other. The same way people would say, Mercedes is better than BMW, or Hondas are the best way to go. A Kia is the best way to go. Again, these are all just vehicles to try to talk about social change. And so we originally started with kind of good corporate citizenship. Then Whole Foods really shot up and talked about conscious capitalism, and that's a more values based view. So their features are more value based. Then you had CSR, and so CSR ended up being kind of a marketing strategy view of like, we want to actually have a CSR report. 90% of Fortune 500 companies now have a CSR report. Recently, in the last 5 years, we've seen ESG, and it's more in the finance departments of, it's great that you're going to say you're going to do good, but let's actually track it and say, are you actually doing good? And that's really where ESG, the origin story behind ESG, came from. But the reality is they're all trying to do the same thing, which is making sure corporations are in the business of not just creating profits, but making sure social impact happens at the same time.
That fair enough. This podcast is the Trust Show. It's all about trust, and in fact, the idea of having you as a guest to discuss this here in the podcast came when you mentioned one time that we had lunch. You mentioned that deploying CSR or ESG in a company, in a corporate, increases the trust that and you were very specific, the local community has in this organization. Say more about that. How does it increase trust?
So when you look at the statistics around corporate brand, there is a intangible thing that we call goodwill. And so when I decide that I'm going to make a choice around a number of things, so I have a choice around where I work, what company I'm going to go work for. If I go work for a company, I also have a choice of what products I buy. What we've now found is more and more consumers or more and more employees are looking at not only what is this organization going to pay me or how much does this product cost, but what is this company doing for the community? And so I've talked to a number of HR directors, and they say that those are some of the top questions they get from candidates across the board. And then you see more and more from a product side, people asking questions around products. So you'll see on the label of a lot of products, they'll talk about fair trade or they'll talk about different things. And this is because consumers are wanting to make sure with their purchases, they're not unintentionally harming the environment or individuals, humanity, et cetera. And so you see people saying it's not enough for me to give into my community. My purchasing power and where I work also has influence. And so I think, to me, if you look at some of the best brands out there, they're the ones that have heavily invested in corporate social responsibility within the constellation of the things that they're doing to make sure that their organization is equipped with building their brand. So at the end of the day, you can have great corporate social responsibility, but if your product isn't very good, well, game over. So it has to be part of the overall strategy of the organization. And so that's really where we're seeing corporations playing in that space, deciding they're going to have corporate social responsibility and reports, to create transparency and trust. And they're also hiring people coming out of a lot of these social entrepreneurship programs that I was talking about, who can ask questions of the company with every decision that they make. So not just their operations, but also their HR policies, their marketing policies, and making sure they're putting it through the lens of, does this make sense for the company, but also does it make sense for the community as well? And is there any externalities we need to consider?
Yep. You mentioned Milton Friedman and Peter Drucker. Milton Friedman really started with the purpose of the business is to generate wealth to its shareholders. And Peter Drucker said business has two and only two functions. What is it? Innovation and marketing. And it seemed I read their material too, and they have evolved, and I think they evolved to the point of there is, first of all, there's more than shareholders, there
Mhm.
are stakeholders,
Stakeholders.
and the
Mhm.
second thing is there's more than profit, there is value. And I think, I do that a lot in my entrepreneurship class at SMU, where I ask students, what do they care about? What do they value in a car? So, for example, you said a car gets you from point A to point B. I would have to disagree because for me, a car does more than that. For
Sure.
some people, car does 0 to 60 in a certain amount. For other
That's right.
cars, it's the safety. For other customers, it's the safety. For other customers, it's something else. When I ask my students about light bulbs and why would you care about LED light bulb versus an incandescent light bulb, the number one value that it brings, and sometimes my students forget it, is they make light. But then
Mhm.
there are other values, the fact that you have to replace them less often than you would incandescent. But some of the students emphasize the environmental benefit. So this is where we go into different people see different values. So that's a great point, and we see that both Friedman and Drucker have evolved. But sometimes I get the sense, and I bet that you do too, that companies deploy CSG or CSR or ESG just for show.
Mhm.
I did that on a TV show when we talked about ethics, where some
Yeah.
companies have a code of ethics just for show, but some companies deploy CSR just so that they can say we deploy CSR. Do you see that happening?
Absolutely. And I think it started out with the best of intentions, but my theory behind this, and it's not been proven, so it's just my anecdotal theory based on talking with companies, is that we got caught up. They got caught up in the popularity of CSR. And as you know, we have fads all the time, and aren't necessarily a trend. And so they saw the statistics saying that employees want to see it. They saw the statistics that consumers want it. And so they got caught up in that. And unfortunately, the vast majority of CSR, and this is still true today, functions in the marketing and PR department. And so if you don't have people who are skilled around that, it will be the sizzle. I call it the sizzle and the steak. It'll be the sizzle of here are all these things we're doing, and there won't be steak to back it up. To say, what are we actually doing and can we sustain this competitive advantage? And I'll give you an example of why I believe this. So, in my class, corporate social responsibility, we do battle of brands. And so, two students take on competing brands that are Fortune 500 companies. So, Pepsi versus Coke, Southwest Airlines versus American. And they basically analyze those corporations for their CSR strategies. What the students have found in doing that analysis is over time, because we look at the CSR strategy over time, company A will say, we're going to reduce plastic by 50%, by this date, 2030. And then over time, they never see that statistic ever again. So they're not tracking, can they actually do it? So they make these grandiose, claims of we're going to reduce plastic or we're going to do this or we're going to do that, but they don't put the stake behind it and say, okay, now here's how we're going to reduce plastic. And here's the sources of how we're going to do it. Here's how we're going to revolutionize both customer sentiment, but also our assembly line to make sure we're reducing it. And our suppliers, they don't think about the value chain, and so that's a typical marketing and PR thing where they'll just say that. And I think we live in a society now where consumers are smarter than that. And they basically now recognize there's more and more companies that are abusing CSR. They realize there's just the sizzle, no steak. And so they're skeptical now of CSR strategies. And then coupled with the fact that we now have cancel culture. And so, interestingly enough, there's some new statistics that say consumers will reward for good CSR or for good behavior, but they're also going to punish companies for bad behavior. And so this is one of the reasons why I have been advocating to anybody I can in corporations as they, bring me in or ask me questions and say, your first responsibility is to do no harm to the community. So at a baseline, that is the floor. You shouldn't be polluting. You should be treating your employees well, all the things you should be doing. Then the ceiling is what more can you do for the community? And if for whatever reason you're in a cash crunch, there's probably not a lot you can do on CSR, but some incremental things. And so you've got to be really careful about what you say in the community. And so, from my perspective, it has to be more than CSR is a marketing tool. It has to be part of your strategy. And I encourage most companies to have someone in the C suite who is chief impact officer, who is looking across the entire organization and saying, here are the ways that we can be a better corporate citizen. And right now, we just don't have corporations, I think, that feel like that is a high priority. But I think you're seeing that shift because they're getting punished now for doing bad things, and it is affecting their bottom line. So if Milton Friedman was still alive, he would say, you know what, actually, I'm going to change my view because now companies are losing money because they're making poor decisions that are actually affecting their market return. So corporate citizenship, in my opinion, is table stakes. Like they have to do that now in some
Right.
form or fashion because they can lose their competitive advantage so badly with just one bad headline.
You use the word, an interesting word, and I'm going to answer my next question, because my next question was going to be, how can you tell that the company is doing it just for show? And I think, when you talked about a chief impact officer and you talked about the PR firm, I think the first question to ask would be, what was the motivation? What was the trigger?
Mm-hmm.
Where did it start? Did it start by the CEO saying, this is important, we care about the impact that we leave on our community or on the world or on our planet or on other planets? Or did it start with the public relations department? Did it start at the marketing department? Did it start because the marketing department or PR said, we have to have a CSR angle to what we do? And so they're the ones driving it. When they're the ones driving it, I think the motivation is just not the right motivation. And when you have the wrong motivation, when you don't have intrinsic motivation, when you don't do it
Mm-hmm.
because this is the right thing to do, this is when people don't trust you. They trust you
Right.
when you do it because of the right reasons. You do it because of the actual impact that it does and not because of the PR impact to your company. Does that make
So
sense?
let me give you a case study on this. And this is why I wanted to do this podcast because I'm learning from you about how to think about this through the lens of trust. So let me give you two different large companies and their what happened as a result. And this is why I think Friedman would change his view. So let's take Pepsi as an example. And so, Pepsi is a local company. I have high respect for them, and they make lots of really great decisions when it comes to their CSR strategy. However, as some people may know, recently, so in the last 4 years, they did a commercial with one of the Kardashians where she is handing a Pepsi at kind of a George Floyd kind of social justice rally, and they got a huge amount of kind of backlash associated with that. For a variety of different reasons. So it's probably, you could look online, watch the video, and you could see how it was just not meeting the moment. And it was so tone deaf. And we talk about that in class. And like Pepsi, who probably has an infinite amount of money to hire the best advertising firms, how did they let this slip? Like, how did they not watch this commercial and not say, okay, time out? There's so many things wrong about this commercial. Um, and so it's interesting because you also have to have a culture of trust where there had to have been people in that room who should have raised their hands watching that commercial and going, I don't think this is right. Like, we've either got to rewrite it, we've got to get a different celebrity, like, whatever the case may be. But interestingly enough, and again, this is one data source I have, I don't know what the current data is, but as a result of that, they lost more than they gained from that commercial. In theory, commercials are all about getting additional purchases. Pepsi is now the lowest level brand when it comes to Gen Zers and millennials, and many of it tie it to that commercial. Because if
Yeah.
they look at Gen Z purchasing habits before and after, it hasn't changed. It hasn't gotten better. And so it was not just a small blip where they were able to apologize. It's actually hurt them with a full generation of people who are making choices at a critical age of what brand they're going to support Coke or Pepsi. And so that's a great example of where we've got to have the right people sitting at the table when these decisions are made from a PR marketing perspective. But we also have to make sure that the culture of the organization has enough trust where someone can raise their hand in that room and go, I don't think this commercial is right for our brand. Or here's what could go wrong related to this commercial. And so I'm going to use another example of a commercial. So let's talk about
Yeah,
Nike.
before
So,
you move on to
yeah,
another example, I'm not going to defend, but I can explain why something like this happens. And in fact,
yeah,
it's not going to
please.
be me who explains it, but Robert Cialdini, who's the head of the
Yeah,
psychology department in the University
one of my
of
favorites.
Arizona. And he gave, as an example, he gave the Watergate affair and what
Mm,
happened there. And he said, how was a group of smart people sitting in the room all suggesting to do the same thing, uh, except for one person. I don't remember who that one person was. And the thing is that there is peer pressure, and you're sitting in the
mhm,
room, and you bounce things off of people who think very similar to you, and only that one person that joined. First they wanted to spend $1 million and do all kinds of things at Watergate, and then somebody said, "Well, no, that's too much. We're doing too much." Then they lower it to 500,000. Then they lower it to 250,000. At 250,000, because of his principle of concession, everybody said, "Yep, good idea. That's what we're going to do." But it wasn't because it was a good idea. It was because they went down from 1 million to 500,000 to 250,000.
mhm,
The only one person who disagreed was actually the person who that was their first meeting, and even at a quarter
mhm.
million said it was bad. But anyway, that's how I would explain how a group of smart people come up with an idea that ends up being stupid. But you had another example.
Well, and you know as well as I do, Pepsi not only had a group of people who are advertisers looking at it, but they had a whole team of staff looking at it. And then they probably had a focus group looking at it beforehand too. So there was a lot of issues that they had across the board. So let's use Nike as an example. And just so you know, every company has issues related to their CSR strategy. I mean, no individual, no company is perfect. And so that's one of the things I want to encourage people to be careful about is we're not asking for perfection from companies. Like part of their goal is to figure out how they create greater social impact over time. So my advice is always to start small and build. But Nike's another good example of in a similar time period, they did their Colin Kaepernick actual commercial. Some people would say that was highly controversial. And again, there are different people who have different opinions about whether kneeling during the national anthem is the right thing to do. Just like, whether or not those protests during after George Floyd were the right thing to do. Again, that's unrelated to this conversation. What it's related to is this idea of did they make the right choice around that commercial? And so, because Nike, for a long period of time, has talked about this idea of just do it, and it's been a brand, their whole brand is around doing things that are slightly controversial. Remember the Apple commercial, remember all the different things that they have talked about. It was consistent with their brand. And so, interestingly enough, when the commercial got shown and there were people who said, I'm never going to buy Nike again, those weren't Nike customers in the first place. And so with the people who actually bought Nike, it actually did increase their sales because they were like, you guys, I believe in people taking a stand. Even if I don't agree that this is the stand I would have taken, this wouldn't have been a hill I would have died on. I appreciate the fact that someone did and someone lives to their values, even if it's not a value that I share. And so, interestingly enough, if you look at both commercials, Pepsi has not recovered because it didn't know its audience. It was unlike any other commercial Pepsi had ever done before because it wasn't connected to people's brands. They were trying to be in the moment and be cool in the moment, but they lost out big time as a result of not thinking it through in the right way and not meeting the moment in the right way. Nike, on the other hand, met the moment, took on something controversial, and it actually helped their brand with the people who actually would buy the brand. And so, to me, when a company does something controversial, they just have to think about how is this going to affect our brand? And is it consistent with things we've said before? And is it going to turn off any of our customers?
Yeah. And Jeff Bezos, you're familiar with Jeff Bezos.
Mhm.
He's a very famous astronaut. He said once that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room.
That's
I'm
right.
always leery about companies that are boasting about their CSR or ESG, their contribution, their impact on society, and taking positions in their commercials. And I always prefer to for them to be known for what they really are doing instead of just talk about it all the time. But let me switch gears for a second.
Do you mind if
You
I actually
use
make a footnote about
Yeah,
that?
yeah,
Just because I think
sure.
you'll find this interesting. So I mentioned that we're kind of in this messy middle with CSR. So 5 years ago, everybody was doing CSR because it was the popular thing to do, and we really could get boosts in customers and boost in employees as a result. So that is, and so you saw a ton of commercials. And so the example that I always use is the Super Bowl commercial. I've tracked Super Bowl commercials over the last 10 years in my classes to see how many commercials are about, look at us, we're a good company, and look at all the great things we're doing. The last Super Bowl commercial lineup, there were no commercials that were like that. Because again, they were so worried about the backlash. And because companies right now, I think, are in a freeze mode, there's fight or flight, but then there's also freeze. They don't know what to do because there's so much controversy around so many different topics. They're going back to their old ways around advertising, having it be just about the product and trying to
Yeah.
steer clear of any type of social issue that could get them into trouble. So I just thought you'd like that little piece of
Yeah,
research.
no, that's very important. You use the word generation, so I want to touch on this.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Up until now, what I knew, what I read was that as we go to the younger and younger generations, they are more socially aware, more environmentally aware. They care more about the environment. They want to buy from companies that care about the environment as much. And it was really a surprise for me that 2 weeks ago, or yeah, just about 2 weeks ago, a survey came from McKinsey, and it was done over 15,000 people, and they were weighing the value of product versus so customers weighing the value of products versus their own values. Young customers are de-emphasizing the importance of sustainability in their purchases. And so the question is around importance of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) in purchase decisions. And this is percent point change from the second quarter of 2023. This this study was done in the first quarter, their study. Oddly enough, the U.S. here, of all the advanced economies, the U.S. here ranks the lowest on all four generations: the boomers or older, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. So it says that boomers are 2% less worried, or they say that the importance of environment, social, and governments. And I'll point out something that you pointed out to me, and that is these are the percentages of respondents that said that it was very important, not just important or mildly important, very important. That percentage went down 2% for boomers in a span of 9 months, 2% for boomers, 1% for Gen Xer, minus 7% for millennials, minus 6% for Gen Z. So to me, that was the opposite to what I thought I knew. What do you think?
You know, um, so there's so much to unpack here. So I'm going to talk about it from a lot of different angles. So the first angle is, and I think it's important for us as professors to talk about how we talk to students about how to consume data. And we live in a place where big data exists everywhere, but it doesn't mean the data is quality data. And it doesn't mean that data sources can't conflict with each other. And so the first thing I always tell people when they look at something like this is to see who actually did the survey, and actually look at how the survey was actually done. And so first thing here is it's done by McKinsey, which has motivations around why they did the survey. And again, I won't speculate on what those motivations are, but the reality is their headline around ditching ESG. I wouldn't necessarily say that would be how I would interpret it as someone who's an expert. It's a great headline to get customers, and it's a great headline to get clickbait, no doubt about it. But when it comes to the actual research, I would do what I tell my students, which is triangulate it against other things that um, Gen Zers are doing. So, for example, take a look at it relative to not just their purchasing decisions, but also where they're wanting to work. Other things that are doing before I would say Gen Z ditching ESG. And in fairness to McKinsey, they put a question mark on there. So they're
Yeah.
just kind of putting like the thought of, are we ditching ESG? So the second thing I would say is I would, as somebody who's been studying ESG for a while, I also have a treasure trove of research in my classroom with Gen Zers, say that I don't think they're ditching ESG. So my interpretation of this data, and again, this is one person's opinion at a qualitative level, but I'm a subject matter expert, is they're not necessarily ditching ESG, but I think the problem that this research has is it doesn't look at other things that are very important to them. So we're all struggling with what is happening at the grocery store and how much we're having to pay for lots of different things. And so the example I would give is I'm sure lots of Gen Zers are buying coffee these days, to go to these jobs and to make their way and to move up the corporate ladder. Well, coffee itself has become pretty expensive, and they've got lower salaries. And so they've got to make trade offs and choices around, do I buy coffee that is regular coffee, or do I buy fair trade coffee? And fair trade coffee, which is ESG, so it is a better coffee for lots of different reasons, is twice the price, for all the reasons that we talk about with why fair trade is more expensive. And so they're having to make choices around, I've got to make my bills, I've got to pay for things. And so, do I buy the coffee that is less expensive, or do I buy the coffee that's more expensive? And my guess is the economy has a lot to do with this statistic. And not just for Gen Zers, I think baby boomers also are having issues around what's happening at the checkout. So my
Yeah.
guess is that the research is a little bit imprecise, and I would encourage them to look at this related to the economic conditions as well. And my guess is if and when the economy improves, we'll see those numbers go back to their normal rate. And I would also look at other factors. So, for example, I did look up the statistics around Gen Z and their employment. They still are in double digit numbers choosing employers who do good ESG and good CSR currently. Again, because there's not price sensitivity associated with that. Inflation has nothing to do with it. And so
Yeah.
I would just say I don't think they're ditching ESG. I think that the evidence is probably not strong enough to suggest that yet, although it is a cause of concern. And we may need to think about how we rebrand ESG and kind of think about it in a way that consumers better understand it and think through those trade offs.
Yeah. That you remind me of a story I think I told you that I actually use in my own keynotes. I remember during COVID, one day I turned NBC on at about 6:55 a.m. I heard a news piece here in the local affiliate, the NBC DFW, that said that the number of COVID cases in Texas declined by 60%. And 5 minutes later, as NBC turns to the Today Show from New York, they started with an alarming news piece that said that the number of COVID cases, especially in the South, specifically in Texas, went up 81%. I didn't touch the remote. Within the span of 5 minutes, the same network on the same channel gave me the number of COVID cases in Texas went down 60% and went up 81% at the same time. And I thought, how could that be? I figured that the data is coming from the CDC. I went to the CDC's website, and what I found was that it did go down 60% over the last month. It did go up 81% over the last week. Why would they give different slices of the data?
Mm-hmm.
Well, for that, you have to listen to what they said right after that. Because what the local affiliate said is the number of COVID cases went down 60%. The governor is going to ban mask mandates. And a decline of 60% supports that position. When they talked at New York at the Today Show, right after saying it went up 81%, they said people get vaccinated. And the number of cases going up 81% would support that. I want to read to you a paragraph from the Book of Trust that right after we talked about the McKinsey survey, I reached out and found. And here's what it says. In 2005, Dr. John Ioannidis published a research paper titled,
why most published research findings are false, analyzing
Mhm.
49 of the most highly regarded research findings in medicine, so of all
Mhm.
areas in medicine,
Mhm.
declaring that when the findings of those studies were retested in larger studies,
Mhm. Mhm.
16% of them were contradicted, 16% of them showed a smaller effect than initially stated, and that 68% of them were never challenged by follow on studies. And one of his findings was that financial and other interests and prejudices, let's just call it for what it is, confirmation bias, offer intervene with the study, causing the results to be less likely to be true. So I brought this up really initially when I brought this up, the study, it was to ask you, so Suzanne, is it declining? But what we ended up in our initial discussion realizing is how important it is, if you want to be trusted, how important it is
Right.
to be free of confirmation bias, to correlate studies with multiple sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other example I would give you, which has been debunked, and with medical studies, there's a huge risk associated with them moving forward. And that's why, I worked at the American Heart Association, and peer review is so important. And I've been in those peer review rooms where the doctors and researchers are debating each other. So I just want to caution folks, like medical research in general, by the time you hear it, it has gone through all those various filters. But every person in that room, to your point, has some type of bias.
Yeah.
And so that's why peer review is so important. But
You
what's
know, when I
interesting,
did my, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
so I was going to say, I'll use another example. So, the example that I like to give recently, because as you know, one of my areas of study is collaboration, is that about 10 years ago, everybody was so fascinated by the technology companies. And so a lot of the technology companies were doing these kind of open schemas so that everybody got to be around each other. And then you saw nonprofits adapt to this, where there weren't offices anymore. You were in this open environment and other people were around you, et cetera. And they were like, this is going to improve collaboration. Well, now true researchers who actually are looking at lots of different things actually have found it actually reduces collaboration. It doesn't increase collaboration. But how many companies shifted their floor plans because of one consulting firm or some architecture firm or somebody with one study who said this improved collaboration? And then we went fully into that. And now most offices have that, that office plan. And now we realize it actually reduces collaboration. And so it's just interesting how we quickly will be duped by research and then everybody will get on board. And then all of a sudden we're like, now, why did we do this? Was this really a good idea? So I also
Yes.
encourage my students to be somewhat of a skeptic around before we go to scale with anything. Innovation is great. Like, as you know, I love innovation. But only about 20% of ideas are actually viable. And then you've got to prove their impact. And to your point, you've got to prove the impact in a different circumstance to make sure it actually truly is impactful before we take good ideas to scale. And most people
Yep.
just don't have the patience for that. So I would just encourage people to, when they look at the data and they look at scale, they're just much more skeptical about that transition.
I would even go a step further. When I was working on my PhD, I never took any specialization because I couldn't get enough classes in one specialization simply because every possible elective slot that I had, I took
Mm-hmm.
research classes. So I'll be able to do quantitative and qualitative research. My dissertation ended up being a combination of the two. But, the larger your sample is, the smaller your margin of error is. And so you're asking, if I get, 200, theoretically 200 or practically, I should say, 200 people would give you about a 7% margin of error. Go 500, you're going to get down to 3% and so on. The problem is that people don't really appreciate is, one, the subtleties, the
Mm-hmm.
nuances that give you such a variety of real answers. And the second thing is, use a different word, slice the information slightly different. You're going to have way more than 7% impact on the results. Then let's make the sample bigger. Let me move on
No, and
because yeah, go ahead.
I think you're so right. And that's why I question the McKinsey report and them saying very important as how they slice the data. And I would have loved for them to follow up and say, of the people who had higher income, did that actually change? Look at some factors that actually would have controlled for inflation and income status. But again, that's perfect information. I
Yep.
also agree with you, mixed method is the way to go. So if they then followed up with those people who did the survey and did qualitative research to find out why is this? Why is it
Yes.
going down? I think that probably would have answered the question for both of us.
Exactly, and my dissertation mentor used to call them. He didn't call them qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative he used to refer to as confirmatory. So you have your hypothesis, you confirm them through a survey, essentially a tool, an instrument. Where he looked at qualitative as exploratory, as peeling the onion, and that's one of the biggest things. My biggest discoveries in life, whether it was in the area of trust or anywhere else, was through exploratory research, when you ask why and you start getting to the root of it. We're just about starting to run out of time. I still have 3 questions for you. The first one is, how would you advise a company that to engage in ESG or CSR to build trust in their community?
That's a great question. So first of all, I would make CSR a little bit less complicated. So when I think of this like a layer cake, the first layer is for them to think about what are they doing in the community, making sure their economic responsibilities are important. Again, I'm an MBA, so I want to make sure companies are airtight because again, when they make money, they pay employees. They're contributing to the GDP of their community. That's a critically important social change. They're giving people jobs. Then I would encourage them to think about their legal responsibilities. So making sure they're following all the legal responsibilities that are important. And really thinking about, what more could they be doing associated with that. Then we've got the issue of ethics and being a corporate citizen. And so the first couple of things to me are the floor. Like you need to be profitable, you need to obey the law, and you need to be ethical. And so from there, think about how could you be a good corporate citizen? And I would encourage them to think locally. And I gave you the example. I think sometimes CSR gets put up into these much more kind of elitist views of only Fortune 500 companies can do it. So I'm going to give you the story that I gave you before, which is I was working with a local, business owner who came to me after a session and said, all this stuff that you're talking about, like Pepsi and Nike and all these people, like I don't have the money that they do. And I said, okay, well, let me work with you for free. And we're going to work together on how you can have a CSR strategy. It's not something that has to be super complicated. So interestingly enough, this business owner actually owned a local oil change shop and actually had a chain of them and was wildly successful, like did a really good job at those oil change, had a very good product, had a good following in their neighborhood. And I said, you know what? I want you to find a local nonprofit that maybe is in walking distance from a couple of the different places that you've had. And they found an after school program. Well, that after school program, of course, has a van that needs oil changes. So they got to know that after school program and the directors of the different ones. And it was, of course, once they went on a tour, they were like, we can help with other things. Like you need a mural, you need other things. Like we can help you with that. And so they just got more and more enmeshed in this after school program. So about a year later, they not only were giving free oil changes, but they were also working with their partners in the automobile industry to make sure they got free tires. They actually had a number of their employees mentoring people in the after school program or volunteering. The owner eventually served on the board of the after school program and was actually raising money for the after school program because he saw with his own eyes how great that after school program was. They actually ended up hiring some of the people who, once they got to 16, to work for them. And then they also did, during 1 month, they actually did a roundup campaign for the after school program. So if the oil change was, $19.33, people could round up to $20 and donate to the after school program. And so that is a good example, like a microcosm of, going back to the origin story of when these nonprofits started, what would happen in the early days of American society, where the local companies would just help out the local church or the local school to the extent that they could in small ways that actually had huge returns for that after school program. And so I would just encourage people to think local, think about where they can make a difference. They'll start feeling the feelings around, I can make a difference. This is really cool. Interestingly enough, I actually talked to the gentleman recently, and he said, actually, again, correlation, causation, we don't know. He's had greater retention of his employees. He's actually had some customers in because on one of his walls, he actually has pictures of the after school program and has a tote board of how much that they've raised to support the after school program. He has customers in the waiting room while they're waiting for their oil change who is reading all these things. He thinks some of them have become donors of the after school program, and he thinks they're more loyal to them. I mean, there's a million places to get an oil change these days, and price sensitivity being what it is, he's like, I actually think I've created loyalty with those people. They'll come back to me over the place down the street that's doing it for $16 because they know I'm invested in this community. So again, that's just one anecdotal view, but you don't have to be a Fortune 500 company to do CSR or to be a good corporate citizen. You just have to think locally.
And there's something else that comes from, I think you made it very clear and loud, and that is think locally. Your local customers, the people that would value what you do outside of profit and product and the standard value that you get from a product, those are the people that need to trust you. And the other thing is when you do things locally, you really have a firsthand impression of how what you do really impact. And when you have that, you're probably more invested in it. I will point my audience to something else, and that is you had quite a few years ago, you had a TEDx talk, and I thought it was a beautiful TEDx talk because you said donate or not donation, contributing does not have to be only of money. And we keep thinking of, if we're going to throw some money here, then we're socially responsible. But you gave, I think it was 5 different things that you can do that are not necessarily money. And you just gave that example. We're about to wrap up. So I have one last question, and that is, how can my audience find more about you and your work?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I definitely appreciate you mentioning the TEDx, and it's called Everybody's a Change Maker. And so it gives you really tactical things that you can do to make change in your community, and get that feel-good feeling of making a difference and having a purpose. And you can see the tangible results of that work. So I think that TEDx talk is a fun one, and I'd encourage folks to watch it. We also, for the nonprofit and business space, we have a weekly blog called Social Trend Spotter. And so it covers lots of different things. It's not just for nonprofits. This week we're talking about advocacy and the importance of using your voice. So one of the ways you can help social change is using your voice and making sure your voice is out there talking about whatever issue you care about, whether it's the environment or education or social justice. Using your voice is completely free, but it makes a huge difference around making sure policymakers, and you know this better than anyone, are choosing the right directions for our country. And then I would say the other thing that you could do to connect with me is I've got a website, socialimpactarchitects.com. We are completely open source. And so every framework or tool is all completely free online. So if you work for a nonprofit, if you work for a company, or you're just interested in making a difference, we've got a whole lot of good resources and blogs that we've written over the past 10 years that can really help you take your organization or your community to the next level.
That's great. Suzanne, it was great having you on this show. I think we gave our audience today a very broad view of corporate social responsibility, environmental, social, and governance, ESG and CSR, how they connect with trust. So first of all, thank you for being on our show today.
Thank you. Well, thanks for all you're doing to make this issue important. And I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to share a bit more about corporate social responsibility.
And with that, that's all we have for today. I hope that gave you an opportunity to think about trust a little differently, a little different aspect of trust. May trust be with you. This was The Trust Show. If you enjoyed this episode, like it, subscribe to this channel, and get informed when I release more episodes like that. And remember, the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can you be trusted?